that's okay. Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this Independent Socialists in Wellingborough Zoom meeting with Joseph Healy, who some of you will know is on the National Council of Left Unity. And Joseph, have you heard the results of whether you're the national spokesperson yet, or?
No, I think it's. I think the results are coming this weekend because the national secretary was asked about that last night. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, Joseph has stood for as one of the four national speakers for Left Unity, but the election results are not known yet. Joseph is also the international secretary of Left Unity and has extensively travelled around Europe and no doubt elsewhere, meeting political parties, left groupings, community organisations, progressive organisations around Europe, and is particularly knowledgeable on the issue of European politics. And so I'd formally like to welcome Joseph, who's going to talk about, it's a bit of a broad topic, I must say, so you've got a bit of a task on your hand, Joseph, the kind of the political situation in Europe. I suppose we'll listen to what you say, but I'm sure you'll be able to draw some themes as to what's happening from this vast continent that we call Europe. But welcome, Joseph, and welcome to everybody else as well. And thank you for coming this evening. So over to you, Joseph.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. And I've been at a number of the ISW meetings before. I think I was a speaker once before, but I've been along to a few of them, and I've always had a good welcome. Yeah, as you say, Paul, I'm the international officer at the moment on a job share with Andrew Bergen, who's not in very good health. And somebody mentioned the Breakthrough Party there earlier, and we are involved in talks with the Breakthrough Party, which are progressing quite well, about the possible formation of a new party. And one of the things we in Left Unity are particularly keen on is that any new party will continue membership of the European Left Party, which has its warts. But as Paul says, I've been to a number of their conferences and executive meetings before the pandemic, I have to say, and I'm still on the cultural network of the European Left Party. They have a number of working groups, and the cultural network actually deals with, cultural issues across Europe. So, I mean, as Paul said, it's a large and diverse continent, so I'm obviously not going to be able to go everywhere, but I'm just going to take a few examples, and in some cases looking at the left groupings within the country, such as they are, and what the major tendencies are politically. So they're going to start off with France, where there's been a lot of reports in the news about the resistance to the pension reforms from Macron and so on. And there's a checkered history of the left in France. So in the European Left Party, there are at the moment two French left parties. There's the PCF, the Communist Party, but also France Insoumise, which was essentially founded by Mélenchon. And those two parties have had a fractious relationship in the past. And at one point, France Insoumise wasn't actually in the European Left Party, but they've healed the relationship since, and they've come back in. So I'm going to mainly sort of talk about them and the sort of major debate that's going on in the French left at the moment. So the French Communist Party at the moment is led by somebody called Fabien Roussel, and he is really taking the tack of arguing that working people have the right to eat a good steak. That's music to the ears of Alan and other vegetarians, I'm sure. But this is the red blood, the red meat of communist discourse in France. And he's arguing that the left should be a party of work, not the party of welfare. And he's holding a series of meetings across France, preaching these, what he describes as traditional left views. and his comments have annoyed a lot of other leftists, as you can imagine, but have actually made him the most popular left-wing politician in France among people who vote for the right. So this is an interesting point. It's a bit like the Red Wall debate here. Now, counterposed to him is the somebody who's very active in France Insoumise, is Francois Ruffon, who's much more of an intellectual. He's a journalist and filmmaker turned politician, and he sees himself as a practical socialist. He's written a new book called I'm Writing to You from the Somme Battlefront, and describing his alienation from the left-wing politics of the working and middle class of his own constituency in the Somme area. He says that the votes of the provincial, outer suburban and blue-collar workers in France, the heartlands of the Gilets jaunes rebellion, are being abandoned to the far right. He says that the left risks becoming what he describes as a cacophonic alliance between eco-bobos are the middle-class urban left, the ecos, if you like, and the multiracial inner suburbs. So an alliance between the eco middle class and the mainly ethnic minority inner suburbs. And the provincial working class wants higher wages. Now, the Greens, who are the other factor in this alliance at the moment in the French Parliament, the Greens want low or no growth. But Ruffon argues that people of all classes want security, and the France Insoumise appears to be anti-police at the moment. And there's a big argument, I mean, mirroring in some ways the debates that are going on here about the Met Police at the moment. Many working people are fearful of immigration, and they associate the left with the defense of racial minorities. Ruffon is saying that it's time to abandon the culture of permanent indignation within the left coalition. The left coalition in the parliament is called Nouvelle Union Populaire Écologique et Sociale. So it's basically a lash-up of the communists, France Insoumise, and the Greens. And he says, I believe with great passion in the values of feminism, ecology, and anti-racism, but we must not fall into the trap of speaking only for the eco-bobos or only for the rural poor. We must find a way of speaking to everyone and finding a message of hope. And there's been a lot of speculation that Ruffon may actually put himself forward for the next presidential election to replace Mélenchon. Mélenchon is going to be 75 at the next presidential election. Mélenchon has already had one or two bites of the cherry. He did reasonably well last time in the presidential elections, but Ruffon may possibly be the new leader of La France Insoumise and of the radical left. He wants to heal the divisions within this coalition of forces, and he wants to recapture the moderate left voters who went to support Macron since 2017. He argues that it's time for the radical left to make its peace with the pro-European, pro-market, reformist centre-left, or the social democrats. He says, I'm going to demise myself. That was one of his jokes. And he's arguing that the social and ideological and generational differences enfeeble the French left. And although he talks about demising himself, he calls himself a revolutionary reformist and remains stridently anti-European, anti-market, and anti-big business. I mean, the anti-European element is something that runs through both the French left and the French right, with Le Pen and so on. So going back to the communist leader, Fabien Roussel, he's also looking at a presidential nomination in 2027. And his comments on red meat and so on and welfare resonate with blue-collar workers. Many of them have moved to support Le Pen's party, Rassemblement. And his views on work are very similar to those of Ruffon, but his personality is less appealing to the eco-bubble wing of the Left Alliance. So Ruffon is more attractive to them. And then the final sort of element of the left are the Greens, who they talk about uniting all left-wing and green causes. So they have a rather unstable coalition in the French Parliament, but obviously they came together now more recently over the pension issue and so on. But a lot of the commentators are saying that the real winners from this wave of opposition, you know, extra parliamentary and otherwise, will be Le Pen and the far right. They're seen as the instigators of it, really, even though both blocs voted, you know, were voting against the government in the French Parliament. So I think worthwhile keeping our eyes on the situation there. So moving to Italy now, which is a country which, in my opinion, does actually have a fascist government. I know that's rather controversial, but I think it's true. So the last election there last year, the Left Alliance, which consisted of the Democratic Party, the Social Democrat Party, the Greens, and the far left, won 26% of the vote. And the Democratic Party in particular, but the left in general, prioritized issues such as LGBTQ plus discrimination and citizenship for the children of migrants. And these were mocked by the right as, you know, the sort of marginal issues which were the concerns of the metropolitan elites who live inside the larger cities. And this was at the expense of the issues that most concerned their former working class base, which was the cost of living and wages, which have remained stagnant for 2 decades. I mean, the Italian economy has not been in a good state for a long time. The Democrat Party, of course, you know, had been very much a center party and had been transforming into the establishment for many years. And when the leader of the main trade union refused to endorse them before the election, you know, that was a sign that something was wrong. Now, since the election, a new rising star of the left has appeared from within the Democratic Party called Ellie Schlein, and she is the deputy president of Emilia-Romagna region. And actually, I heard her speak when I was on the Committee of Another Europe is Possible. She actually came to one of the meetings and spoke, and she is quite impressive. She's a bit like, you know, the radical Democrat in America, Costa Gomez. Costa, she's very similar to her, and she is promising that she's going to try and reconnect with the working class base. So the thing about what I said about fascism is that a new book has just come out. It's been published by Pluto Press by David Broder called Mussolini's Grandchildren, Fascism in Contemporary Italy. And, you know, there are indications. I was talking to David Kellaway recently, who is an ACR, and he lives some of the time in Italy, writes a lot about Italy, and you know, they are clearly drawing links between Mussolini and the fascist past, and they're rehabilitating people from that era, changing street signs and things like that. And the party of Meloni, the prime minister, is the Fratelli d'Italia, you know, the Brothers of Italy, and they have a direct genealogy from the Mussolini regime. They've launched a fierce culture war against the left, polarized political debate around World War II, and secured the largest vote share in Italy's general election. So, you know, Broder says in his book that 80 years after the fall of Mussolini, his heirs and admirers are again on the brink of taking power. So Broder's book highlights the reinventions of far-right politics since the Second World War, and the interplay between a parliamentary face aimed at integrating fascists into the mainstream and militant fringe groups, which, despite their extremism, play an important role in nurturing the broader far right. And the Fratelli d'Italia has retained its hegemony over fascist subcultures while embracing a raft of more pragmatic policy positions. So they have, for example, a very Islamophobic, very anti-migrant position. And as a result of that, you're witnessing more drownings now in the Mediterranean, where distress calls are deliberately being ignored from migrant boats and so on. I mean, they're very, very clear about what their policy is. And interestingly enough, there was a lot of concern when Maloney seemed, about to come to power, that the new government would take a very different position on Ukraine, because the Italian far right has flirted a lot with Putin. I mean, Salvini, the leader of the League, was, photographed many times going around with Putin T-shirt and things like that. But interesting enough, the Maloney government has actually supported the NATO position and support for Ukraine and so on. So there's an interesting combination of policies there. The Italian left is very weak and very fractured. I mean, the far left, outside the Democratic Party. And I have met them on a number of occasions at events organized by Transform Europe, which is like the think tank, if you like, of the European left. And they just seem, it's astonishing to me that even in the face of such, a fascist threat, they seem really unable to work together. But that is, of course, often the curse of the left, as we know. Now, turning to a country which I know very well, Ireland, when we look at a lot of Europe, the position of the left doesn't seem very strong. But Ireland is one of the potential breakthroughs, I think. So at the moment, Sinn Féin is leading in the polls and is on 35%. Compared to Fine Gael's 21% and Fianna Fáil's 16%. All my nephews and nieces who are in their 20s and 30s are all voting Sinn Féin. It's a very generational thing. There's a lot of resistance to Sinn Féin amongst the older generation, mainly because of memories of the Troubles and so on. But amongst the younger population in the Republic, there's a lot of support for Sinn Féin. And the Republic is on, the edge of a powder keg at the moment over the housing crisis. I mean, there is literally no housing for young people. And a recent poll in the Irish Times suggested that 50% of young people wanted to emigrate because of the housing crisis. I mean, rents and so on in Dublin are probably as high as, if not more than London. And there's virtually no social housing being built. So interesting enough, Mary Lou McDonald, the leader of the party who could become the new Taoiseach in the next election, was interviewed recently about, their policies. And she was asked about obviously the reunification of Ireland is one of their main policies. And she was asked, would this just mean stitching two reactionary states together, i.e. the North and the South? And she said, looking back on the centenary of the Civil War, this year is the centenary of the Irish Civil War, which was fought about, the type of state that the Republic would be and so on. And she said, it's remarkable how accurate James Connolly was when he predicted that partition would lead to a carnival of reaction. We ended up with a single party state in the North, a Protestant parliament for Protestant people, and decades of oppression. But for too many people, let's say it out loud, home rule meant Rome rule, and women and the poor in particular suffered the consequences of that. The last thing we want to do is repeat these mistakes. So they have, I went to their Ordesh a few years ago as an observer, their conference. And it was on that Ordesh that they took several major steps, towards becoming a mainstream European left party, and they supported abortion rights. They have very, very strongly in support of the LGBT community, women's rights, and housing and education. And they're talking about introducing a free health service. The Republic has never had a free health service. When Sajid Javid was recently praising the benefits of the Irish health system, I mean, I don't know where he got his information from. Well, we know where he's coming from ideologically, because anybody in the Republic knows that you pay for everything. You pay for a visit to the GP, you pay for a flu jab, you pay for a visit to the hospital, and everything is run on an insurance system. And the Irish health system is in a terrible state. So this has become a big issue really in the unification debate, because people in the north who might be minded to vote for reunification point to the fact that the north has the NHS, weak and all as it is in the north. It's very bad in the north of Ireland, but that there's no free health system in the south. And Mary Lou and Sinn Féin have made it very clear that should they come to power, their aim is to actually have a free health service. And they have policies like having a rent freeze and a big program on building of social housing and so on. So some of the things that have helped them have been, Mary Lou talked about the bursting of the property bubble a decade ago. There was Ireland went off the scale really as regards building at that time, and there were what were called ghost estates. I mean, property developers just built estates in the middle of nowhere, and then when the bubble burst, they were just abandoned. So it's a bit like these follies, which are found all over the countryside of bankrupt building schemes. So she said the bursting of the property bubble a decade ago was hugely traumatic and transformative in terms of political thinking. And she said then you had Brexit, Boris Johnson, and belligerent Toryism, and that always impacts on the Irish political scene. So she says, bear in mind that we're not finished yet. So she's talking about the fact that all the opinion polls, around reunification. I mean, obviously there's a cost to the Irish taxpayer of reunification, but all the opinion polls in the Republic have been, largely in support of reunification. So there has been a sea change, where before people in the Republic would have been much more cautious. So, in many senses, things are moving in Sinn Féin's direction. Sinn Féin is obviously not the entire Irish left, but it is going to be the dominant player. I mean, there are smaller parties in the Irish Parliament because we have PR, like People Before Profit and so on, who, do play a very vocal role as an opposition. But clearly any new government, this is the other factor that Sinn Féin have actually said for the first time. They decided at that Ard Fheis that they would enter a coalition with other parties. I'm just going to turn very quickly now to Hungary, which is again, I think it's important to look at the East, former communist states. And Hungary, of course, has been ruled, has in fact, it hasn't really got a democracy anymore because it's a pseudo-democratic state now, with Orban having banned free press, the judiciary has been nobbled and so on and so forth. I wrote an article a couple of years ago called The Urbanization of Britain, where I said that Boris Johnson was pursuing similar policies to what Orban was doing in Hungary, with these headlines describing the judges as the enemies of the state and all this sort of thing, and proroguing of parliament. These are all typical Orban moves. So recently there was a quite famous Marxist philosopher in Hungary who died, who was seen as the main influence in the left opposition. There is a small left party in Hungary which comes to all of the European left meetings, but electorally they're not very strong. Orban has been very adept at using anti-Western rhetoric. So, accusing the EU of various crimes. And of course, he made this big thing about George Soros, who of course was Jewish. And we all know about the history of anti-Semitism in Hungary. And he portrayed George Soros as this evil Svengali figure who, through his financial influence, was trying to destroy the Hungarian nation and Hungarian culture and so on. So the end result was that the European University, for example, which was based in Budapest, was forced out. And there have been ongoing battles with the European Union over human rights issues and so on. And he's passed a he's passed a law against the LGBT community, very similar to Clause 28, which was here, where issues can't be mentioned in schools and so on. He's also played around the war, and this becomes a big issue for states, particularly in the East and in the north of Europe, in Scandinavia, Russia and the war. And Orban has been very good at this and has actually argued that Hungary will take a neutral position. He will not allow any arms or supplies for Ukraine to be routed through Hungary, and has said that, you know, he's positioned himself that in the event of any war, he will prevent Hungarians from being conscripted into any forces and so on. And that has actually gained him a fair amount of support. But his policies on he's gradually abolishing things like free education and the health service and so on and so forth. And the left, the last election, the mayor of Budapest, for example, came from the left. And there was a lot of hope. The left finally came together in Hungary in the last election. A very divided left came together, but it didn't make many inroads really. And so Orban seems at the moment in, you know, quite a strong position. I've just gone. Have I gone on too long, Paul? Am I all right?
Fine, keep going.
Yeah. So just turning very quickly to Scandinavia, to Sweden and Finland. So the Left Party in Sweden is, after the Social Democrats, they're the smaller Left Party, and they voted against joining NATO recently in the votes. There were only two parties against joining NATO. They were the Greens and the Left Party, and the Swedish Left Party is not actually a member of the European Left Party. They have remained outside. But the issue of Russia and the proximity of Russia and so on is a big issue in Scandinavia, particularly for countries like Finland and Sweden. And there's big opposition to NATO, to joining NATO, particularly from the Kurdish community, because one of the conditions that Turkey, Erdogan, has forced on NATO and Sweden is that if he will only agree to Sweden joining NATO if people who he characterizes as Kurdish terrorists are deported to Turkey. So there's been very, very big opposition from the Kurdish community. But the other big issue, of course, in Sweden has been the rise of the far right, and that has come as a big shock. Now, it's interesting that Sweden had a left-wing structural majority from 1932 until 2006. But since 2006, has actually had a right-wing structural majority. And people always think of, you know, Scandinavian social democracy and progressive policies and so on, but there has actually been a sea change, not just in Sweden, but in Denmark as well. I mean, attitudes towards migrants and things like that. And the big surprise this time was the Swedish Democrats, the far-right party, who actually became the second largest party. They are not in government, but they are the kingmakers. And, you know, they do play, their policies obviously are moving the Overton window to the right. And the Left Party, although it, you know, was the left bloc, if you like, which includes the Social Democrats, didn't win in this election. The Left Party did quite well in the election, and it boosted its support among young people in the cities, and particularly amongst the immigrant working class, because obviously they can see the danger posed by parties like the Sweden Democrats and so on. Yeah, so the main theme of the Swedish election last year was about crime and immigration. And of course, there was a conflating of the two issues in the fact that the far right argued that, you know, crime was a major issue in Sweden. There had been a series of notable robberies and attacks and things like that. And they concentrated on a city, Malmo, which has a very large migrant population. And that worked very effectively for the far right. They described it as the criminal caliphate, and you can see the Islamophobia involved in that. But yeah, so the Left Party did quite well in places like Malmo, for obvious reasons. And actually, the Left Party has seen its membership rise in the last 10 years or so, from 10,000 to over 30,000, which is quite significant. And they have also reorganized the party very, very effectively. One final word on the NATO thing is that Finland, there's a Left Party which is in government, which is in the European Left Party. And I saw an interview, she appeared on a Zoom meeting recently. The leader of the Left Party in Finland was asked why her party had voted in Parliament to join NATO. And she said it's quite simple, really. The vast majority of the population wanted it. And she said, we are quite prepared to go to our voters. Well, I think they're having an election perhaps this year. She said, we're quite prepared to go to our voters and see, what they think of that. But for countries which are obviously near Russia, like Poland and Finland and so on, the issue of NATO and the Russian war and so on is a very, very, very hot topic. Anyway, I'll stop there, Paul.
Thank you very much, Joseph. That's a pretty good start for a roundup around Europe, but there are some common themes emerging, it seems. I mean, the rise of the far right, whether you describe some of them as fascist or authoritarian, and seems to be a particular theme, except, but even in Ireland, I think there's been more based around anti-immigrant feelings. So that's the other theme. So one is the rise of the far right. The other one is the anti-refugee, anti-migrant feeling. It seems to be almost kind of universally a political challenge for the left across Europe. Are those two things, I mean, those two things are clearly related, but does that seem to be one of the biggest challenges that perhaps faces the left across Europe? The immigration issue is defining politics. I'll throw that question in to start with, then I'll open up to others.
Yeah, I think that's undoubtedly true. I mean, as you said, Ireland, for example, believed that it was immune from this phenomenon until a few months ago, really, when demonstrations started outside migrant centres and things like that. I mean, to be fair, Ireland has taken per capita far, far more refugees than, say, the UK. And they also have a substantial number of Ukrainian refugees. So, for example, many of the hotels in Ireland, which traditionally were used for tourism, were block booked by the government to house refugees and so on. But I think in Ireland, you've got a toxic combination of the housing crisis, which I mentioned earlier, which is probably, one of the worst in Europe, with the migrant situation. So you can see how that can be used, quite effectively by the far right. But the good news is that there was a very, very large pro-migrant demonstration recently in Dublin. And I think electorally, the far right are not making many inroads. The bad news is that they are impacting on the current government, who are clearly, going to try and argue that Sinn Féin would be, would open the doors to migrants or whatever. And I think the current government is going to sort of lean more now on migrant rights, and there's already indications that the government is not willing now to accept more migrants and so on. But I think it's a theme across the whole continent, and where it's being used very effectively is in places like Italy and Hungary and so on. The ironic thing about Italy is that they have a demographic crisis. It's one of the oldest countries in Europe. So economically, they desperately need migrants. And one of the things the Fratelli d'Italia, the fascist party, are going back to Mussolini's idea of giving medals to women who have children, is that they're arguing for an increase in the Italian birth rate, and arguing that the migrants are going, the great replacement theory, that the migrants are going to take over and so on.
Would anyone else like to come in at this point? Tony, I see your hand up. If it would help if you could use also, if you're familiar with it, the reactions button at the bottom of the screen, and raise your hand using that, because that comes up onto my onto my screen, and I can see clearly who wants to speak. So first to Tony, I see Alan's wants to come in, and Rowan then wants to come in. So Tony first.
Yes, thanks, Joseph, for what you've said. Is there any significance in you not having mentioned Germany at all? That's the first question. Second comment is to do with the past history of the left in relation to Russian invasions. In 1950s and 1960s, the Russian involvement in Hungary and then Czechoslovakia had, I think, probably pretty powerful effect on the left in Europe. Are we in a different age now? Because then there were pro-Russians and there were anti-Russians on the left, and across the whole of Europe, I think the left was split. Are we talking about a decade? Well, so there's two questions. One is about what's going on in Germany, because there are significant things about the German left and its part in the governing coalition. And the second thing is the left in Europe now unified? And is it a totally different scene from that in the 50s and 60s, where Russian invasions caused huge rifts and I think undermined the cause of the left?
Joseph, did you want to come in now, or did you want to take another contribution and then?
I'll take another contribution, Paul.
Okay, yeah. Then Alan, if you'd like to come in now.
That's it. No, I've moved. What am I doing? Right, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Yeah, clicking the wrong thing. Yeah, I suppose two words really to describe what Joseph has just gone through that come to me is interesting and terrifying. Before I get to the question, which I hope Joseph can answer, as I think you said, Paul, there definitely are connections between the rise of the far right and fascists, because, you know, I think Joseph's description of the Italian prime minister as a fascist, well, if that isn't a fascist, I don't know what is. So we've got the rise of the far right, we've got the refugee migrant issue, and we've also got the democracy or lack of it issue. Joseph mentioned Orban, and I think I'm right in thinking that before the 2019 general election, Johnson had 2 meetings with Orban. So, you know, and Orban, I think doesn't he describe Hungary now as openly as an illiberal democracy? And we're clearly seeing the culture wars issue, the restrictions on rights to protest, thinking of taking away the right for so many workers to go on strike and so on. If you pull it all together, is the European left not now thinking that they need to have something like we had a few years ago in the UK, which was how to combat the rise of the far right, to have a European-wide meeting to deal with the rise of the far right and the destruction of democracy in so many states that go hand in hand together with the culture wars, all this stuff about anti-wokery, refugees and so on? That's my question.
Thank you, Alan. Joseph, do you want to come back now?
Yeah, so it was Tony, wasn't it? So you asked about Germany. Well, you know, the reason I just didn't cover Germany is because I wanted to get a flavor of the different parts of Europe, really, the south, the north, and the East or the center and the former communist countries. I think the situation in Germany is, I mean, in the European left, Die Linke, the German party, has been the dominant party, the richest and the most established of the European left parties. And it's interesting that both presidents, there's a new president now from Austria, but the former two presidents were both German. But Die Linke are in trouble. Die Linke, the vote has really gone down, and they're in such a state now that if they're barely able to mount the 5% hurdle, which means if you don't get 5%, you don't get any seats in the German parliament. And there has been a very serious development in Die Linke. Now, I mean, some people here might know, but I'm in a minority in Left Unity's executive around this, because some people on the executive are very influenced by Sarah Wagenknecht and her movement in Germany, which is essentially an aspect of the German left, where they've gone back to this traditional German orientation towards Russia. There's always been two elements in German foreign policy, an Ost and a West, and this is the Ost one. And she called a very large demonstration recently against the war in Berlin, but included in that were elements of the far right and some ex-generals in the German army, one of whom actually has praised a Nazi theoretician. And many commentators have said that this peace movement, and I've actually seen reports on German television of some of them saying, well, we don't want a war because the working class in Germany are having to pay for this. And essentially, we've got no problem with Russia. Why can't we be friends with Russia? And Wagenknecht has very skillfully used the argument that the increase in gas prices and so on is due to the war, and therefore that the German working class are paying for, it's a capitalist war and the German working class are paying the price. But the coalition that she's brought together, as I said, includes the AfD and the far right. And there is, her partner is his name has gone out of my head now, but the former prominent
Lafontaine,
the former prominent social democrat leader. And I think what they're doing is they're playing with fire, really, because and a lot of the arguments behind this movement are that they don't want an American-dominated security apparatus, but they're quite happy to have a German-dominated one. So it's almost like a return to pre-World War II, German military thinking. The other thing, of course, is that curiously enough, the Linke have done better. I mean, we know their history. They came from the PDS and the former East German Party, and they teamed up with the elements of the Social Democrats from Lafontaine. But they've in the last few years done better in the West than they have in the East. They haven't done very well in their former heartland in the East, which is where more severe poverty is. They've actually done better in the West. And this comes back to the argument in France about the eco-bobos and so on, about middle class, culturally progressive and so on, people, rather than the traditional working class, many of whom now vote for the far right. On the left being unified, within the European Left Party, there's been very lively debate about the war in Ukraine. I mean, most of the European Left Party has taken I wouldn't say a pro-Russian position, but certainly an anti-Ukrainian one, arguing the main campus line that there should be ceasefire now and so on, arguing against NATO and the delivery of weapons and so on. The exceptions to that really have been the Danish party and one or two others who have actually managed to get the policy documents slightly altered and tweaked, where they do, mention much more self-determination of the Ukrainian people and so on. But the left across Europe is hugely diverse. So, I mean, in the East, for example, there's still the history of communism and Stalinism, which means that the left parties are tiny, very, there are very few countries in the East. I mean, the exception might be Slovenia, but in most of the former communist countries, the left, I mean, in Poland, for example, there's no left party at all, really. And so they're very, very small, and it's mainly in France, Germany, and so on. I mean, Italy is a disaster, as I've said. But I mean, on most issues, other than the war and so on, I think the left are fairly united. And I think, yeah, Alan's questions was about Orban, and yeah, I mean, definitely there are links between Orban and Johnson, and this is all part of the, the Fascist International, really, which Steve Bannon and people like that got together. So you got Salvini, Orban. I mean, Orban was feted last year at the Republican. There was a big Republican jamboree in Florida or somewhere, and Orban was feted by the US Republicans, who were saying, we wish things were more like Hungary here. And his agenda is being, fully taken on board by the Trump supporters and whatever. And this orientation towards Russia. I've said that Meloni's government surprised people when they didn't actually pull out of the NATO operation about Ukraine, but most of these, I mean, the Sweden Democrats and a lot of others, they have this orientation towards Putin and towards, destruction of democracy and so on, and the culture wars, of course. I mean, the other big factor is the LGBT. They all have that in common: attacks on women's rights, attacks on the LGBT community, and so on.
Other questions? I think now it's Rowan. If you could unmute and come in, Rowan.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to build on what Joseph and others have said, and kind of offer a sort of full defense of, I guess, the category of creeping fascism, because I think what we're hearing describing really warrants that category and actually makes it very useful, and actually makes not having it quite dangerous for the left. I remember after the Capitol attacks in the US, some on the left who were very critical of our sadly lost comrade Neil Faulkner, who's dearly missed, did an about turn, and then they've done an about turn, and they've kind of shunted that aside subsequently. And I think what there is a failure to understand the core point of Neil Faulkner and other comrades' work in the book Creeping Fascism, which was a very complex and nuanced argument. And in part, it was about how fascism is not a top-down process, but how it is enacted through government and not mass movements on the streets. And the distortions of the example of Nazi Germany in this respect, because especially in the respect of it being a street movement, the example of Nazi Germany is misleading in that they had a very robust left to fight in the streets against, and that led the Nazis there to enact themselves as a very strong street movement, whereas in other examples of fascism and similar far right ethnocentrist movements, that hasn't been the case even historically, and even in Nazi Germany, the sense of it has been exaggerated. But that other part of the thesis, which is that it's a process rather than an already evolved, fully formed thing, that you just have fascism or you don't. I think that's what leads people potentially astray on this question, which is that they expect to see the very worst atrocities of the very worst fascist governments to be immediately enacted, or nothing counts. And I think that does a disservice to being able to anticipate the trajectory of history. And if you look at the trajectory of history, I think we're in a phase where, yes, in the Anglosphere, with both Trump's likely arrest or possible arrest, and with the current pillorying of Johnson, it looks like these forces might be waning. We might be going into a Labour government. But what we have is a global crisis, an ecological crisis, a financial crisis that the liberal class has no answer to, and has consistently had no answer to since 2008. And given that situation, it then falls to some alternative to propose a solution. And as Joseph has been aptly describing, the left is a mess. It's fractured, it's incoherent, it's willing to bolster the reactionary logic of the far right in some instances, and we've seen that in Britain around the trans movement as well, but we've seen it even around COVID to some extent. And we've definitely seen it around COVID on the continent. We've seen it over and over again that the left isn't willing or able to cohere a narrative, and I think that's because of the historic crises, going back to the fall of the Soviet Union and through the sort of long retreat of the 1990s and neoliberalism, going back to the 1970s there, that the left is just very organizationally weak. And so the threat of the far right in these circumstances is massive. And I think that those who are on the the line of this attack can see that very clearly. In Britain, pretty much every category, if not every category of hate crime has been massively increased. Novara Media put together the figures for a few years in terms of anti-trans hate crime, and worked out that it had been over 100% in a 2-year period. The impact of that is just incredible. And I think one of the other resistances to the creeping fascist sort of thesis is that, and it's the best argument I've heard against it, is that some people feel like it downplays just how bad liberal regimes can be, whilst being perfectly liberal. And I think that's true. Liberal regimes can be atrocious. I wouldn't describe George W. Bush as a fascist. I wouldn't necessarily describe the government in Sweden that had, I think, eugenics type laws around sterilizing trans people who wanted to transition as fascists. Liberal regimes can do atrocious things. The regimes after the Second World War did atrocious things. There isn't this neat demarcation in history between these kinds of different class societies. Fascism isn't a new form of political economy, and it's not a new form of society wholesale. As it said, it's a process. But I think what you can see in the level of corruption and the capturing of institutions, in the logics of people like Orban that state explicitly both extreme Christian but also very ethno-nationalist logics for their states, and the kinds of associations that Trump has, the kind of associations Boris Johnson has, the way that they rule without even the pretense of a sense of the judiciary having a valid oversight over their rule. I think you can see a trajectory in all of these things. And then in the explicit targeting of, in Orban's case, Jewish groups, in many instances in France, Muslims, and pretty much everywhere, the LGBT community. I think there is a continuity here, and then in some instances in Italy, in India, that continuity is actually direct. You can trace a lineage, a political lineage between these parties and the fascisms of the 20th century. So I think it's very important that the left really joins with, I think, most sort of grassroots activists already say in describing these things as fascists. I get that there's a kind of hang up because historically I do think it was unwise to characterize Bush, although I think he helped lead us to this place. I think it was unwise to characterize him as a fascist. I think that doesn't help with our categories and our being able to very clearly delineate what we're talking about. But I think that the time has come to start using that language and to be very rigorous in our condemnation of what's going on, and also to be very aware ourselves of what's at stake. Thank you, and thank you to Joseph for a wonderful presentation.
You're muted, Paul.
I better unmute myself. Yeah, I'm going to take Bob now as the last one with his hand up. But then if we take a 5-minute break and then come back and take any other questions. So during the break, people who haven't spoken yet could perhaps think of questions that are in their minds or what have you to, or points to make, and we'll pick it up after the break. Is that?
Oh, could I just respond very quickly?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, Joseph, please
Something that
respond
Rowan
to that.
said.
Yeah, please respond to
So,
that. Well, if we take Bob and then respond to both
Yeah.
Rowan and Bob, and then we'll go into the break, if that's okay. So if we take Bob now, and then Joseph, you respond, and then we'll take the 5-minute break.
Well, I just wanted to bring it home to the UK, Joseph. How do you see the chances of a unified left party materialising within the UK? That's my short and sharp question.
Nothing like putting me on the spot, Bob.
Bob's well known for his straight talking, Joseph.
I'd just like to respond to Rowan first of all. I mean, I agree with you completely. If it looks like a fish and smells like a fish, it is a fish. The really surprising thing for me is that left unity within the European left is obviously a very small party. But it was left unity who actually pressed. I mean, the European Left Party has working groups on all sorts of things, on trade unions, on feminism, on health or whatever. They had no working group whatsoever on the far right or fascism. And you consider what's going on in these countries. So left unity actually pressed for that and got that. And the Left Unity held a fairly major conference in London called No Passaran about this a few years ago, and had some very prominent people from the left in general come and speak, and some came from Europe as well. Diane Abbott and various people spoke at it. And Left Unity managed to get the European left to agree to a second conference in Berlin, which was organized by Left Unity and Die Linke and the European left, and that was held last year in Berlin. And I went to some of the discussions about that at the one of the European meetings, and there were speakers there, from countries like Germany and Italy and so on, saying what you just said, Rowan. There's a clear line between 20th century fascism and some of the things we're seeing now. And in fact, I've seen comments from people recently saying that even the language, the terminology, I mean, Gary Lineker brought this out, but other commentators have said that they're using the fascist playbook from the 20s and 30s. They're using the same terminology. So they realize that it was effective then, and they're hoping that it can be effective now. And I think this is where history, I would say this as a historian, but I think history is absolutely vital here. To answer Bob's question, so I am personally involved in the talks with Breakthrough and various others about forming a new party, and we've had a series of talks now going back some months, and we're actually having face-to-face talks in London on the 6th of April. And the timeline at the moment is that the new party will be launched by the summer, by July, possibly. And there are various people involved in that. There's Breakthrough, there's Left Unity, there's the independent councillors in Liverpool, there's Thelma Walker, the former Labour MP, and various other people. And obviously, who knows what will happen with Corbyn and so on, but at least, I think that we haven't got a name yet. We haven't reached that point of agreement, even on a name, but we are hopeful that, everything will start in the summer, really.
Just, could I have a supplementary on that? What's the position with Tusk? Would they be involved in that, Tusk?
So at the moment, we're not including them or a number of other groups. we are learning the lessons really from what Left Unity did the first time, which was we went about things quite differently, in that we had a very fluid situation, and when people came together into the new party, and if people know, there were a lot of groups whom Neil Faulkner would have characterized as sects who joined Left Unity at that time, and they caused absolute havoc. I mean, they were sectarian, they were divisive, and we had situations where we had two different branches in one town that couldn't work with each other because one of them would be controlled by the group and one wouldn't. So we decided this time around we were going to have a program, a 10-point core principles and a constitution and so on, and set the new party up and then see where that goes from there. So those groups are not involved in the talks. They were involved in the People's Alliance of the Left, which was like the umbrella grouping, but we found we had very bad experience with them electorally, because they, there was a by-election, I think it was in Coventry.
Yeah.
And without consulting with any of the other parties, they just put their candidate up, and they the idea of working together and consultation doesn't come very naturally to them. So we're just working with the groups that we're working with now, and we'll see how the new party develops.
Thanks for that.
Okay, folks, let's have that 5-minute break. Let's come back at 15 minutes past 8. So how long's that? That's about 5 minutes, isn't it? 5-6 minutes. So let's come back at 15:15 and restart. And then so please, those that haven't spoken yet, please think of contributions or questions that you may have during the break. So see you in a few minutes. You can unmute and chat. The line's going to remain open. So if you want to chat, please do with other people here. If you want to go away and make a cup of tea or whatever, then you can do that as well. So see this as an opportunity to talk if you wish. It's not you don't all have to disappear. I am going to disappear. welcome back to the second half of this event that's discussing European politics, and some of the themes that are emerging in the discussion that was had during the break is very, very interesting. So I'd like to just invite Alan to kind of just kind of summarize what you said during the break, what your real concerns are, and also Rowan, if you could come in after Alan and kind of summarize what you just said again in the informal bit. Is that okay? And then I'd like to see people coming in who haven't spoken before, if that's okay. So
Alan. Just very, very briefly. I think I said it. I kicked off by saying that I started this before the meeting, worried about the rise of the far right, and after listening to Joseph and the other discussions that we've had, I'm even more worried now than I was before. And one of the things that I cannot grasp from a historical point of view about the left is why it doesn't seem that many leading groups are saying, look, in the 1920s and the 1930s, when we had all these social and economic problems and so on with the Great Depression, instead of the Socialist Party and the Communist Party working together in a united front, they worked against each other. And I have to say, it's one of the reasons why, like Joseph, I am so keen on trying to bring different left groups together into a bigger organization, because we need to have something big enough to attract the people in the middle who are wallowing between the left and the right to come our way and not to be dragged into the circuit of the far right. I put in the chat a link to Searchlight magazine in case people are not aware of it, and in particular in the most recent issue of how the police in Germany at the end of last year had to bust up a serious far-right threat to take over the government. We need to come together and we need to act. That's me.
Rowan.
Yeah, I was saying that the problem in part is, and I think this is a broader problem that we have with reactionary politics and fascism in general, is that they reflect the prejudices of class society. Some of those prejudices go, back further than our current class society, but nonetheless, those kinds of prejudices are enacted in the way that capitalism is an inherently competitive, individualizing, lonely, crisis-ridden society, where forming into small bands like the nuclear family, with all of the kinds of problems associated with that, has inherent material advantages. And I think part of the problem with the liberal solution to fascism is that they look on it as a problem of irrationality, as a kind of either cognitive error or an example of bad education. When actually, if you look at how fascism enacts, I think that there can be a level of ignorance behind a lot of the prejudices behind it, but often it's people looking out for the material interest within the terms of the current sensuous reality that they have. And it's the irrationalities are there, but they're within those terms, within the terms of the wider society. One of the reasons why the left has a harder time, especially in the so-called free marketplace of ideas, just putting forward ideas as if the society they're putting forward them is a neutral arbiter for all kinds of ideas, is that it isn't. It's that society is the class society that we precisely need to overcome and overturn. And if we treat it as a neutral venue for debate, with groups that merely augment what already exists, I don't think fascists or even the right-wing media are particularly intelligent or particularly perceptive. I think that they're good at bolstering forces that are structural to society already, that emerge organically. This is why I reject the top-down model of the roots of fascism, because I think the roots of fascism are in the very sort of dire conditions, the very separating conditions under which we live, and until we overcome those conditions. But I don't think it's for that reason hopeless. I think that these things have inherent limits to them, The kinds of problems that arise can't really be answered by fascism. And you're seeing that in the kind of Mad Max politics of American style fascism today, where they're literally proposing kind of apocalyptic solutions to problems like climate change. And that's where the left has an in, because we can make the broader critique of society as it exists. And the far right can only do that by obfuscation.
Thanks, Rowan. Unfortunately, Joseph's got to leave us now. So I just want to invite Joseph to say some final few words, and also to formally thank you, Joseph, for coming along and starting off what's a very, I think, really, really important discussion that's taking off about what do we do about the rise of the far right and the weaknesses of the left. So, Joseph, some final words to you.
Yeah, so looking at the constellation of forces really across Europe, I mean, other than the social democratic parties, because I think that's another whole discussion about what sort of role they've played, because certainly in countries like Sweden and Denmark, the social democratic parties in some way have been quite racist. And I mean, in Denmark, for example, they've put through a policy of returning Syrian refugees to Syria and things like that. So, I mean, I understand Alan's historical question, but I think in the current political situation in Europe, it's very difficult for a lot of the left parties to cooperate with social democratic parties, which have themselves bought into, racism and neoliberalism and are quite often prepared to do deals with the right for electoral purposes. I mean, in Sweden, for example, the Social Democrat Party said before they were in alliance with the Left Party, they said before the election they'd prefer to go into an alliance with the right rather than go into an alliance with the Left Party. When you get views like that coming from the Social Democrats, you can understand how there is considerable reluctance on the part of many left parties to work with them. But then there is the larger question, as you've said, of uniting against the right. That is a very big challenge. I think, as I said, the other big issue is in the East, in the former communist countries. The legacy of Stalinism is still toxic. It's very, very difficult to get people to support parties with a left agenda. I mean, there is a small party in Poland called Razem. What Razem is, Razem, for example, is very much in support of NATO, and you can understand why from a Polish perspective. But for that reason, the European Left Party refused to allow them to join because the European Left Party had a position that any party that was in favor of NATO couldn't join the European Left. So there are all these obstacles there. I think the point that Rowan raised about debate and so on, is very significant. The problem is, once the fascists get control, they shut down debate. And so, we've seen this in Hungary. Free media, freedom of expression and so on gradually disappears. And all the organs of, broadcasting, universities, everything become under the control of the regime. And that is the threat we are facing now as well, with the suppression of protest through various bills, the attacks on freedom of speech, and the gradual removal of the power of the courts, the question legislation and things like that. So I think there are grave lessons to be learned from places like Hungary, and we need to be constantly on our guard, really. Because those who forget history are condemned to relive it, I'm afraid.
On that really positive note, thank you very much, Joseph, and I wish you well, and no doubt we'll meet again soon. So please feel free to sign off. But I'd like to continue the discussion. Does anybody else?
Thank you very much for the invitation, Paul.
Yeah, no problem. And we'll see you again soon, no doubt. Derek, do you want to come in at this point? I know your hand.
Yes, please, Paul. I don't know if I'm coming in at the right point. I've been sat here and I surely will not match the eloquence and the vocabulary and the knowledge of the previous speakers. But I've noted that the first time that climate change was mentioned is 8:30 p.m. Now, the reason I'm mentioning climate change is that if we take a look at the world at the present moment, irrespective of what kind of government we're being governed by in whatever country we've lived in, the world is in a pretty poor state. Climate change is a fact and not fiction. And I heard, is it Alan or was it Joseph, saying the left needed an issue which they could gather round. Well, that's quite true. There are a lot of people who are looking for leadership from a political party, either of the left or the right, which does something about the problem which we are facing in the next few years. We're spending hours and hours of talking and ignoring the fact that if we don't do something very soon, it doesn't matter which government is in charge, there won't be a world left living in. And I haven't seen any party of the left or the right which appears to take climate change seriously. So what I wanted to ask Joseph, but he's gone now, is behind the scenes, is there any chance at all that these left groups are going to get together, unite against the problem which we will all face, and it brings in migration and things like that, and do something so that there is some kind of future for the world we live in? I do appreciate, and I find interesting going back in the history, etc., but I think it's now time to start looking into the future and making a world where we have a future. Because at the moment, when I'm talking to people on my allotment, talking to people in the street, more and more people are concerned about the fact they don't have a voice. No one seems to be listening. No one seems to be doing anything about it. And they can see themselves now the effects of climate change. They don't know what to do. They don't have the power. So the people who've got the energy, the left groups, etc., what are you going to do to make me vote for you next time?
Does anyone want to pick up Derek's challenge?
Yeah, well, as I'm also left unity, I'm not speaking on behalf of Joseph, but one of the big problems we have, and one of the reasons why we're trying to bring like-minded groups together, is because it's very difficult for small groups and parties to make their voice heard, in wider society. But I don't know if this is any comfort to you, Derek, but Left Unity is an explicitly eco-socialist party that has played just recently a leading role with Green Left, and we've now set up this eco-socialist alliance that has done stuff around COP26 and COP27, the protests. It's done lots of stuff on social media and so on. And the new party, if it does come off, one of the 10 core values or principles that have been agreed is that too will be an eco-socialist party. Left Unity is supporting XR's, the big one, protest and so on. I'm doing, again, a lot of stuff on social media about that. And Anti-Capitalist Resistance is also an explicitly eco-socialist organization. And one of the things that eco-socialism does is precisely what Derek quite rightly says needs to be done. It brings together the climate issue, the refugee issue, the rise of the far right, the cost of the living crisis, all of those kind of things that create the kind of political mess that we're in, and the dangerous political mess that we're in. The trouble is we just need to be bigger, and that's what we're trying to do in a slightly bigger way by coming together with groups like Breakthrough Party and one or two others. We just need more voices.
Yeah, thank you, Alan. Anybody else want to come in?
Well,
Yeah, Bob, you could.
Yeah, I'd just like to point Derek and other people to a downstream program on Novara Media, which interviewed one of the founders of XR last week, and basically his premise, I think, is that we're at war with capitalism, who have made a decision that they can expend billions of people by continuing as business as we are. You know, it's an interesting watch if you've got a spare hour or so, and I recommend it.
Could you type that into the details into the chat, Bob, with the name of it and
yeah, you can get it on YouTube, and yeah, I'll do that.
What's it called? What's it called? I mean,
the actual program it's a magazine program they have downstream when they interview people, but it's on Novara Media.
Okay.
So you can pick it up on YouTube.
Yeah.
It's with Roger Hallam, isn't it?
Yeah, the name rings a bell, Tony, you know, in conversation with Aaron Bastani.
Well, he was the founder of XR, wasn't he, Roger Hallam?
Yeah, and he's out at the moment he's been on remand for X amount of months, and he's tagged because he made a speech. Anyway, so it's well worth a watch.
Thanks.
Alison, did you want to say anything at this point, or
not specifically on climate change, no.
Oh, on other things. Did you want to make a contribution?
Well,
Sue?
Yeah.
No? You don't have to. I don't want to pressure you to say something but I'm conscious there are people that haven't said anything yet, and so I'm encouraging people to.
I might just say something which might just be a bit of a tangential issue to people, but it's because of the merger. I'm left Unity too, so I'm, very pleased that Joseph is in the midst, one of the negotiators on the Breakthrough Left Unity panel, which I think are the two strongest voices at the moment in the merger. I was, in my mind was the very recent history that we've all experienced, the stuff that's made us leave the Labour Party, come to Left Unity and consider a new political force. And I'm just wondering how much people think what happened can just be put away before or during at the time that we merge and start reactivating it again. I was in a meeting the other day where Martin Ford was interviewed, and there were very, very good meeting about the Labour Party and racism, and that it had sort of focused on anti-Semitism, and that it had been politicized, that it focused on anti-Semitism more than Islamophobia and other, racism. And it was great, but I was left with this feeling that there was a point that was missed. And I think a lot of people left that meeting thinking there was a point that was missed, because there's this massive accusation hanging over all people on the left, really, which has not been, I'm happy to see that there is a lot now seeping through, which is starting to disprove a lot of the accusations that were made against the Corbyn leadership and so on and so forth. I'm just wondering how much redress do you think is needed before we can get a footing again as a joined left party that can be voted for, or if it matters at all even?
Interesting question. I certainly don't have anything,
because I didn't phrase it before I said it. But.
Does anyone wish to respond to Alison?
Well, just very, very briefly, I think it is an issue, and I mean, you can criticize anybody for all sorts of things, and nobody is perfect. And Jeremy Corbyn wasn't perfect, and he should have knocked back on this way that anti-Semitism was being politicized from the beginning. He allowed the opposition, if you like, to make the running for too long, and then it sounded just sour grapes to try and hit back. But one of the things I saw, and I'm trying to remember where I saw it, and if I can remember, I'll put the link in. It might have been on Al Jazeera, where somebody was talking about the Ford report and what it said. And one of the points that was made, that if anybody was to blame for the anti-Semitism complaints, whether they were genuine or not being dealt with quickly, it was not Jeremy Corbyn in his office who couldn't expedite those things. It was actually the officials who would appear from texts and emails and things like that, deliberately sat on them, knowing that it would have actually make Jeremy Corbyn look bad because it looked like he wasn't dealing with them. But I can't remember where I saw it at the moment. If I do remember,
saw that, yeah.
That wasn't the Ford report, I think.
Sorry?
Was it in the Ford report? It was
think-
certainly in. But I'm just, what level do you think we have to? Do you think that needs to be a sort of resolved issue publicly for us as a left, whether Corbyn's in a merge party or not? Do you think that we need that issue resolved? Do we need to be sort of vindicated, as it were? Does it need to be proven he was wrong? Do you see what I'm driving at? Do we? Is it something that needs address? And do individuals, because there are still people very, very angry about this. Do they need redress before they can move on? This issue of redress comes up a lot in international issues, but I don't think we use it much here. But there seems a level of healing that we need to move on as a left, and part of that is to show publicly how very wrong that was. It was so very, very wrong. It was deliberate, calculated. I accept what you say, Alan, about there was a certain weakness that the right wasn't knocked back quick enough. But I don't think they knew. I don't think it just kept coming and coming and coming. It was so. The right are so very well organised when they decide.
Well, it wasn't just the right, was it? It was the media. I mean,
Well,
even the Guardian amplified the whole thing.
That is pretty. Well, sure, yeah, it did.
If I could perhaps chip in, I don't think it's resolvable, because in a sense, the protagonist. I mean, the left, pretty well, the Corbynite left and the left to the left of Corbyn, Left Unity, ACR. You name the socialist grouping, we all know that Corbyn, the anti-Semitism thing essentially was a weaponized strategy by the right in the Labour Party and the wider media and the wider political establishment to destroy Corbyn, to destroy that project. They were absolutely petrified at the prospect of Jeremy Corbyn becoming leader of the Labour Party and then leader of the country, and therefore this particular their project was to destroy him, and you can't compromise with that. And I think if that was the mistake at the beginning, not to recognise what was happening by way of a strategy that was being employed to destroy Corbyn. And I think if that had been recognised sooner, then maybe it could have been headed off. It could have been labelled as what it was, which was not about anti-Semitism at all, but about destroying the Corbyn left project, which was a real popular movement and frightened them. I think it frightened the ruling class and the liberal establishment, frankly. The liberal establishment started to think that they were going to lose control of the narrative to the left, and a popular movement of the left. And therefore they had to destroy. In fact, I think I said at the beginning of the Corbyn project, I was approached to rejoin the Labour Party by somebody in Northampton who shall remain nameless. And I basically said to them, I don't think this is going to work. They're going to do everything possible to destroy this project. And therefore, I was very reluctant to rejoin the Labour Party. But then when I saw how the movement took off, you know, I mean, I went to a meeting in Milton Keynes. I don't know if others went to that Milton Keynes, where Corbyn arrived in Milton Keynes, and there was literally hundreds, if not thousands, of people around the station who wanted to hear him. Young people. I was just absolutely gobsmacked at the number of young people in their 20s who had come to see Jeremy Corbyn. This was a unique political phenomenon almost that I had not seen before of such a popular leader of the Labour Party, and they had to destroy it. And that's the depressing thing, that they succeeded.
Yeah, I think that the anti-Semitism thing, it was really quite clever. But it really was quite clever, I mean, especially for this country, because a left popular movement like that, if you were in Colombia, you'd have just been shot, I think. You know, the leader would have been taken out.
I think that was actually
They wouldn't have had to
next
bother
stage.
with the.
I think that was the next
definitely.
stage, Alison. If they'd failed, I really.
You reckon they? Yeah.
It may not have been the establishment, but I think that they would, if the movement had taken off even further, and Corbyn had said would become prime minister, for example, I reckon that could have been a serious issue for the establishment. You know, the army or the police.
It was an incredible. Well, I'd never seen anything like it, and I'm up here in Cumbria, and I can't remember when it was exactly, but Corbyn was due to speak in Carlisle to Labour Party members only in a hotel. And then I think there'd been a terrorist attack in London. So campaigning was called off for the day. So it was supposed to be a closed meeting. He wasn't going to speak in public, which he was going to do before he then went to speak to Labour Party members. And it was a wet, drizzly, cold day with a cool, really cool wind. And just spontaneously, all those people that had been at the rally in Carlisle and hadn't heard him speak, but knew he was going to be speaking to Labour Party members in a closed meeting, they went to the hotel, myself included, and stood in the car park. And there were so many people in the car park. People were climbing up walls and lampposts and fire escapes because there wasn't room. Eventually, one of his aides came out and said, right, he knows you're waiting here. He will come out and speak to you in a bit, briefly. And she went back. She came again. She said, right, we've found a room where he can talk to some of you for a bit. We went in. Only about half of us could get in because of fire regulations. He spoke to us for about 3/4 of an hour. And then they said, can you leave, please? Because he's going to speak to the other. They were still waiting outside in the rain. It was, I mean, I was gobsmacked. I'd never seen anything like it. Yeah. And of course, he scared the living daylights out of the right wing, the media, everything, because he did, despite the opposition he'd had, including the MP that we had up here, the Labour MP for Copeland, what the heck was he called? Jamie Reid. All right, he was the first one to resign from the front bench the second time Jeremy Corbyn got elected leader, the very first one to provoke a by-election here in the hopes that Labour would lose it, which they did, because that was supposed to undermine Corbyn. He came too close in 2017 to win it, and that was it for the card. And I had exactly the same thing as you did, Paul. Are you going, because I was in the Green Party then, are you going to join Labour now because of Jeremy Corbyn? And I said, no, because he won't last, because the right wing will do everything they can to bring him down. I never expected him to last as long as he did.
Yeah.
Can I just come in, Paul?
Of course, just chip in. Yeah.
Again, I hear what people are saying. And I think what it shows is that it can't be done on personalities. You put Corbyn up, they will destroy him. put someone else up, they will destroy him. It's got to be an issue. And I find that the issue which is motivating and concerning people at the moment is the very existence of civilization as we know it. And a lot of people saying they're turned off by politics because all the politicians are the same. I agree with what Alan said. The biggest problem is getting a bigger audience, and the right are much better at organizing and using the media. But you have to unify across around a topic which, or a cause, which means so much to so many people. And the very existence of civilization is such a topic. It's not a personality. Many people now have forgotten who Corbyn was. They're not interested in the arguments the Labour Party are having with itself, or what the Tories are having with themselves. They want an organisation, because it's going to take an organisation, not at one person, an organisation which can provide solutions to the crisis we face. And the solutions are out there, but they're not being shown. The scientific solutions to climate change are there. The economic solutions to climate solutions are there. So no one needs to think up these solutions. They're well documented. It's getting them out to the general public. And it could be Corbyn, it could be Mickey Mouse, it could be anybody. But that's what I think the left needs to do, is to push these solutions, to stop fannying around and say, look, the time is short, we have to do it. Let's forget about the arguments we've had in the last 10, 15 years, and let's look at what we can do in the next 10 or 15 years, because after that, it is too late.
Sorry, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, come in, Ryan. Yeah.
No, Alison wants to speak. That's fine. I've spoken way more, so that's
well, I was going to say very, very briefly that there is a linking argument between the things that we've said just now onto what Derek has said, and that is the invested interest. It is not just about moving popular opinion against the forces that are destroying our world. There is an invested interest which needs to be done, so the whole of politics needs to be looked at. You cannot isolate climate change as an issue and just ask people to join around it and move. You have to recognize the invested interests that lie and are perpetrating climate destruction, huge deforestation, and the rest of the world is feeling it a hell of a lot more than us. There's been a cyclone in Malawi just recently, which I haven't even seen on our news here, so very, very briefly. There's too much invested interest that keeps a destructive political and social and economic environment, which is causing climate devastation. So it cannot just be about wrapping it up as a single issue, afraid, in my view.
Yeah, I have to say I agree with that, Alison. And again, coming back to Derek, because I do understand his concerns and so on. It's not true that every cloud has a silver lining, but some do. And politically, the pandemic did. Because I can remember what it was like right at the beginning, talking to, because I'm been involved in XR myself. It wasn't like I was outside of it. I had been arguing for ages that when they came up with this slogan, system change, not climate change, they needed to specify what they thought the system was and what kind of system they wanted to change it to. And it was knocked back because you would say, well, don't get political. We just want to bring in everybody on the climate thing. We don't want to put people off. Over the pandemic, I found it incredible, the number of sections of XR that have moved almost totally to accepting, whether they're aware of it or not, an essentially eco-socialist position. It's one of the reasons why a Scottish XR separated from XR UK, because they had moved further and quicker on that than had the UK one. But even within XR UK, that has moved on. And I put into the chat again, this poster, Unite to Survive. It is incredible how XR over the last few years have reached out, not just to organizations like Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth and so on, but trade unions taking part in picket lines and so on in the recent wave of strikes. And one of the reasons that has happened is because there has been so many people on the left, Derek, working within XR who have been constantly making the point that Alison did, that we need to look, why are we in this mess with the climate and so on? Well, there are vested interests. We have to have a broader campaign and organisation to challenge all of the things, the cost of the living crisis, the refugee crisis, the climate, all of it is all interlinked because it's all part of the same fucking system. And I'll put a link in to an article that Left Unity and Anti-Capitalist Resistance that have just posted up on their websites and so on that I did for them on this very thing about, and that phrase, unite to survive, that's not the left, that is XR.
Yeah.
That's what they've come up with.
With due respect, I've been a member of XR for many years now, and the debate in XR is to go away from being politically neutral and become politically active. You're politically active by whatever you do. So for XR to say we need to remain politically neutral does not ring true now with many members of XR. And there are XR trade unions, XR scientists, XR doctors, etc., etc. I can speak from experience because I used to live in the Pacific, and some of the islands I knew and lived on no longer exist. And I know from first-hand experience how the global South and the nations which are producing the least amount of pollution and carbon dioxide, etc., are suffering the most. And I want some political party to acknowledge that. They can call themselves whatever they like. And I do think there are a lot of people now in XR who are far more political than they were when they started. And there's an urgency about them. And they would like to talk seriously and try and change things. But I think that's got to come after the change has taken place and the steps are there to prevent climate change. Then we can go back and start thinking, where did we go wrong? And what kind of society do we need? And is the political system we've got in this country or any other country fit for the 21st or the 26th century?
I don't think,
because most people are not interested in politics because it doesn't seem to be working for them.
I don't think it's necessarily an issue of chronology, like what comes first. Do we want to change the politics or do we want to deal with global warming? Although I absolutely agree there that there's a need to prioritize this.
Sorry, can I just correct that? It's not global warming, it is climate change. Global warming is 1970s. It is climate change.
I've heard the criticism I've heard of climate change is that it sounds too sort of like it doesn't sound catastrophic enough. I always like climate catastrophe, but I'm willing to I'm not too.
Oh, George Monbiot said, let's not call it climate change anymore. It's climate emergency.
I mean, I'm happy with the language. I always get a bit upset when people try to get rid of cost of living, because I think cost of living is a great way to describe a crisis of inflation in terms of people being able to socially reproduce their lives. But anyway, I think the chronology issue kind of doesn't do justice to the totality of forces that we're talking about. There was a discussion in this in a recent conference that ACR had, its yearly conference, where the point was made that the climate situation, that the climate emergency had to run through everything that we did. And I made the point at the conference that is true, but then at the same time, the climate situation would have to encompass everything. We would have to have a way of addressing climate that addressed our other priorities and concerns. And I think that's already a tradition that that many socialists have, that I think, you know, Marxism embodies in many ways, the best of Marxism. And that is of seeing how there are, you know, both particular issues and how they relate to a unified whole. I mean, in the most abstract way, you know, Hegel expresses it in the idea that the truth is the whole, that the truth is, you know, the relation of everything to everything else. But to be more concrete, you know, if you look at, you know, the ACR website and recent articles we've had on disability justice, recent articles we've had on the women's struggle and on imperialism, it does crop up over and over again that, you know, that you can't have a global resettlement that doesn't factor in the harm that the climate catastrophe has already caused across much of the global south and is now increasingly you know, reaping closer to home. You can't talk about disability justice whilst ignoring you know, the changes in seasons and the harm that does to mental health, the sense of pessimism produced by the encroaching disasters and the damage that does to, again, mental health. You know, that there are a whole set of interlocking issues. And the political crisis is another interlocking issue. It's another facet of this. The liberal state has been very aware of this catastrophe for a very long time and hasn't had the political resources or even the material resources to deal with it. They have in the past dealt with very extreme problems. You know, they dealt with the ozone crisis. You know, they dealt with they've dealt with, you know, various other geopolitical crises historically. At this point, and I think that's to do with the financial crisis, which I think is linked but also distinct. I think it's to do with profitability. They lack those resources. I don't think we can fully take on this challenge whilst ignoring or even sidelining the political struggle. But I think that we don't need to either, because they feed into each other. You know, I think one of the problems the far right has is that it's taking these random prejudices and stitching them together into a seemingly unified tapestry of sort of hate and grudges and resentment. But there's nothing really that coherent about it. You know, a fascist international is actually a contradiction in terms, because they represent geopolitical power blocks that ultimately have opposing and competing interests. And the interests of the different social layers that they try and glue together are similarly incoherent and in fact not real. Whereas I think what we find is that the more we unify and the more we bring together the separate crises and struggles of marginalized groups, of those who want a better society, of the environmentalist movement, etc., that they cohere more and more into a unified picture. And that's the danger, I think, of socialists who want to make concessions to the far right on this and that and the other, because that's where prejudice currently leads, because they are damaging that unified theoretical coherency that actually enables us to put our points across and actually enables us to come up with solutions that work. And in fact, in the long run, give, you know, more ground to the forces of reaction. So I think, yeah, we need to stress the whole. We need to stress the unity of the picture in every turn, and that's why we can't give ground on anything.
Isn't that part of going back right to the beginning of this session, where Joseph was talking about the French situation, which I immediately found so depressing, because they seem to be playing off each other rather than finding ways to unite issues around class, race, gender, and coming together at both a theoretical and practical level to challenge the narratives of the liberal democracy and the far right. Instead, they're adopting different ways in which so one political leader in France is saying we need to unite with the working class and ditch all this liberal bollocks about ecology and feminism and and sexuality and gay rights. We need to return to our heartlands of the working class and class struggle. And then somebody else pops up as, we need to. So they're fighting battles which need to be united. The battles of the working class incorporate the battles of the marginalized, disabled people, gay people, trans people, because they're working class too. And yet that kind of narrative of unity against the ruling class, against patriarchy, against racism, against those that are anti-immigrant, is part of the same struggle. And that's why I hate the Social Democrats in Denmark, who themselves are now proposing a Rwanda plan, who themselves are deporting, as Alan said, Syrians back to Syria. These Social Democrats are doing that huge damage to the unity of the working class in Denmark, and just playing straight into the right-wing narrative. So the next government won't be a social democratic government; it'll be a far-right government, and that's not going to do any favours to the working class in Denmark at all. So, in a sense, those that compromise are really dangerous. But I don't want to kick them out completely because I want to change them. I don't want to go back to the 1930s where social democrats and communists are killing each other because one's a social fascist and the other one isn't. So I'm not wanting to categorize the social democrats in Denmark as social fascists, but I am going to stand up to the principles and say to them, you're doing immense damage and you need to stop and think and come with us to fight against, to fight to save the world in terms of the environment, and you need to fight against patriarchy and et cetera, et cetera. I think I made my point. I'm going to stop rambling now. But is that what you're saying, Rowan, in a sense? That it's not either or.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree.
To be successful.
Yeah. And we definitely have to bring those, on the sort of so-called soft left. I think the term is kind of very vague, but yeah, social democracy is almost a spent force now, but nonetheless, the sort of the history of that and the sort of ghosts of that persist. But yeah, I agree. I think the disaster of the sort of dismissing social democrats as semi-fascist definitely can't be repeated. But equally, I don't believe that there's a parliamentary path to socialism or even to saving the world. We do need obviously to enforce our reforms on those in parliament, those in politically powerful bodies through the social movements and through fights in the Labour Party and elsewhere. But I think ultimately, the solutions are going to have to be far more ambitious. And I love Rosa Luxemburg's saying where she said, it's only by demanding everything from the bourgeoisie that we get some of what they can give. And I think that's absolutely true. I think even for reforms, a revolutionary approach is the best one.
I think unless somebody wants.
Can I just say one thing, Paul, in case
then we'll wind up, Alan. Yeah. So
yeah.
Make this the last contribution.
Just really coming back to Derek and his valid concerns and so on. I first of all put up links to both Left Unity and Anti-Capitalist Resistance websites. And if he's got the interest and the time, you trawl through that and you will see how many climate emergency posts and articles and discussions there have been, not just this year, but for the past few years and so on. And taking up the point that Rowan just made about, and Alison, about things needing to come together, putting them all together. I put in a quote from Michael Lowy, one of the early eco-socialists and so on, and that really has got it in a nutshell. Anyway, that's me done.
Thank you. Well, just to bring this together, just to thank everybody that's contributed to the discussion tonight. I think it's been another excellent event, and I hope that we'll see many of you at future ones. Just to to point out a couple of future activities and events that are taking place. On the 1st of May, Monday the 1st of May, we've got our May Day and Wellingborough Diggers Festival, which runs in the evening, and we've got live music, political speakers, food, drink, and combining of politics and fun in one event. So, the Wellingborough African Caribbean Association on Monday, May the 1st, and you can buy early bird tickets now on the web via Eventbrite, and there's information on the ISW Facebook group. I've emailed out today. There's stuff on Twitter as well. So
what a lovely way to celebrate my birthday.
Well, please come along, Alan. I mean, I've already had Simon Pearson contact me this afternoon saying that he hopes to come to it. So please make an event of it. Although you may just want to go out for a meal with your family.
Is this a live event or a Zoom thing?
It's a live event. No, it's a live event. Right. A live event, which I know you have issues with. But no, this is a live event on May the 1st. The other thing, we have got another a Zoom event coming up. Our next meeting in April, the 4th Thursday in April, which date I can't remember. And we hope to have somebody called John Padwick speak to us about the Newton Rebellion of 1607, which was quite significant. Newton's a village in Northamptonshire, and the Newton Rebellion was part of a wider Midland Rebellion against enclosures and oppression by the ruling class of the feudalism. So John's going to come and talk to us about the Newton Rebellion. And that leads up to the May Day event, and of course, which celebrates the Wellingborough Diggers, which was also a movement against the ruling class of the day. So, has anybody else got any other announcements that they want to make of events or activities that are coming up? I can't see anybody. But anyway, thank you very much, everybody, for coming tonight, and we hope to see you at future events.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, thank you. Yeah,
thank you.
Bye.
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 And thank you for your chairing, Paul. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Bye.